What happens when you try to enter the promised land too soon? There's a telling moment in chapter 14 of Numbers when Bnei Israel decide to sort of rush the goal line. It's a devastating moment, really. The spies have returned with their false report, and the people largely buy into the narrative. They are too strong, we are too weak, we can never prevail. The people, eventually forgiven their failure of faith and imagination, but when the punishment comes, it's more than they can bear. Ad matai le'edah ra'ah hazot asher hema malinim alai, says God. How much longer shall that wicked congregation keep muttering against me? Say to them, as I live, says the Lord, I will do just as you urged me. In this very wilderness shall your carcasses drop. Save Joshua and Caleb, every single Israelite who was liberated from Egypt is to die in the wilderness. And the Kadosh Baruch Hu is explicit that the punishment is meant to fit the crime. You shall bear your punishment for 40 years, corresponding to the number of days, 40 days that you scouted the land, a year for each day. But when Moses tells the Israelites the bad news, we're told, V'yit'ablu ha'am me'od, they were overcome by grief. What happens next? Early next morning, they set out toward the crest of the hill country, saying, we are prepared to go up to the place that the Lord has spoken of, for we were wrong. But Moses said, why do you transgress the Lord's command? This will not succeed. Do not go up, lest you be routed by your enemies, for the Lord is not in your midst. For the Amalekites and the Canaanites will be there to face you, and you will fall by the sword. In other words, too little, too late. Yet, defiantly, we're told, they marched toward the crest of the hill country, though neither the Lord's Ark of the Covenant nor Moses stirred from the camp, and the Amalekites and the Canaanites who dwelt in that hill country came down and dealt them a shattering blow at Hormah. It's a gut-wrenching moment, reminiscent of Cain's cry after murdering his brother Abel, Gadol avoni minso, my punishment is too great to bear. Or perhaps it's like Esau's reckoning, having spurned his birthright, Habracha chati lecha avi, barcheni gam ani avi. Have you but one blessing, Father? Bless me too, Dad. And Esau wept aloud, we're told. Perhaps you've had a moment like this in your life. A time when you did something you knew was wrong, but because of anger or blindness, you thought you could get away with it. For me, it was during a rebellious teenage moment when I said some things to my parents that, well, kids shouldn't say to their parents now, no matter how angry they are. And my folks grounded me and made me miss my sister's birthday party. And I was hurt and embarrassed. But I learned my lesson. There are times when you can go too far, and after the fact, there's no talking your way out of it. You just have to wait it out and bear the consequences. You are left on the outside looking in at some experience you might have had if only you had held your tongue or behaved a little more responsibly. For the Israelites, the border is closed. A question we might ask, though, is why not just encamp on that border? Why all this wandering? Just after the failure of the spies, God says, now the Amalekites and the Canaanites occupy the valley. Start out then tomorrow and march into the wilderness by way of the Sea of Reeds. Penu us'u lachem hamidbar derech yam suf. The obvious answer is that encamping on an enemy border for an extended period of time is sort of asking for trouble. But could there be more to the story? Is there something essential about the Midbar, the wilderness itself, that plays a formative role in the narrative of our people? The Israelite wanderings in the Midbar are largely a mystery, a sort of black box of sojourns, as God and Moses run out the clock and allow the formerly enslaved generation to die off. Underscoring this point is the fact that so few biblical chapters capture the narratives of this time. Yes, our Parsha, Masei, mentions several specific locations during these years, 20 of them, in fact. before we return to the southern border, likely about 50 miles south of Beersheba, and make our way quickly toward the eastern border of Eretz Yisrael. But the majority of these place names, Ritma, Kehelat, Makhelot, and more, are not mentioned before or after. We know really nothing about them. Just how long does it take for the Torah to relate the 38 years that passed between the incident of the spies and the arrival back to the border? 5 chapters. That's it. There are 187 chapters in the Torah. 4 of the 5 books of the Torah occur almost entirely in terms of the narrative between Egypt and Canaan, and almost all of them deal with 2 to 3 years of wandering. Chapter 14 ends with the story we described of the failed attempt to battle the Amalekites and the Canaanites without God's support. Chapter 20 begins with the death of Miriam. Where does that occur? Well, back in Kadesh Barnea, the same place where, according to Numbers 13:26, the spies bring their pessimistic report. Even the rebellion of Korach, the key event that occupies these intermittent chapters, seems to have occurred at Hatzerot, which is only 3 stops from Midbar Sinai, the wilderness of Sinai. In other words, while some of the action detailed throughout the Exodus narrative may well have occurred during these 38 years, the Torah makes a point of keeping that chronology obscure. A lot clearly happens in the first 2 years. The Exodus itself, key battles against the Amalekites and other foes, the revelation at Sinai, the golden calf, the design and construction of the Mishkan, and more. Half the book of Numbers and the entire book of Deuteronomy take place in Arvot Moab al Yarden Yericho, in the steppes of Moab at the Jordan near Jericho. It's in the final year or so that Miriam dies. Moses hits the rock. Aaron dies. Bilam and Balak hatch their plan. Pinchas arrests the plague, and Moses gives his final instructions to the people before he dies on Har Nevo. We have almost no confirmed events happening during the vast majority of the time spent wandering in the desert. Why the 38-year blackout? Perhaps it has something to do with the word midbar. Midbar is a wilderness, but it's related to the word lahadbir, which means to pasture one's flock. A shepherd guides his flock from place to place, providing water, shade, food, sustenance. But lahadbir is not just shepherding. There are other words for shepherding. It's really about sort of almost like dominating, controlling. In fact, in modern Hebrew, the word lahadbir has come to mean to suppress or to exterminate, right? Like as in if you want to call an exterminator. And so the idea is that there's a kind of a line that exists between the loving work of shepherding a flock or directing a herd and sort of an oppressive act that actually is more destructive. The midbar is a place of constant tension, of persistent seeking. Getting through the midbar isn't easy. It requires vigilance. The midbar is a place of formation, but in a similar way that a crucible is a vessel of formation. Sort of like childhood and adolescence, really. If you think about it, one might look at the entire Exodus narrative as a metaphor for the growth and the maturation of the Jewish people. We were entrapped in the convulsing womb of Egypt and birthed through the Sea of Reeds into the Midbar. During that time, we were fed and nourished by God with manna and quail. Our clothes did not wear out. Our shoes did not degrade. Entering the land of Israel might be understood as a sort of weaning process, a coming of age in which we're forced to exist in a new reality of self-reliance. But just like young adulthood, self-reliance is not quite self-sufficiency. So while we could no longer depend on manna from heaven, there was still an ark There was still a temple at which to commune with God through sacrifice, the Urim and Tumim to help divine heaven's answers to inscrutable questions. During the period of Jewish sovereignty in the land, kings could rely on prophets to convey God's wisdom and God's judgment. Bit by bit, these overt connections to divine interference begin to fade away. The ark disappears. Pirkei Avot tells us Torah was passed from the prophets to the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah, the men of the Great Assembly, and then eventually to the sages. In other words, just as it takes time to grow up, to mature, it took time for our ancestors to be ready for the promised land. It took time within the land to be worthy of a more independence from parental divine intervention, for God to move to more of an advisory role. There's a beautiful midrash about Mattot-Masei that the reason we list each of the stations along the ancestral journey through the wilderness is because the sages want us to compare this to a king whose child is taken ill. And his father, the king, takes the child to a specialist. The Kadosh Baruch Hu, according to the Midrash, says to Moshe, record the journeys that Israel undertook in the wilderness in order that they should know what kind of miracles I performed for them. How will they know? From all that they read regarding Mattot-Masei. These are the journeys, our Torah portion. On the way back, the parent reminisces, here is where you had an ache, and here is where you stopped to rest. During childhood, everything is clear, at least in the moment, but looking back on it, most of it's a blur, is it not? We remember key moments, emotional highs and lows, lessons we learned the hard way, but much of it is sort of a black box. We're reminded of things when we look at pictures, we watch old movies, old videos, when our parents, siblings, or childhood friends relate stories. But most of the Midbar is decidedly less specific. Perhaps that's what's really going on here. Maybe this is about memory. Because for all the things that we don't remember, for all the things that fade to the background, that disappear from our recall, there are those moments that we do remember. We're reminded of them, we come back to them. And why is it that we do that? In all likelihood, because we're trying to understand them. Because we strive through memory, not to relive our childhood, our adolescence, not to be back in the Midbar, but to try to understand what we learned from those key moments that stand out in our memories in our wilderness experience. So what happens, as I said, when we try to enter the promised land too soon? When we're not ready? Well, it's sort of like opening up an economy, commerce, and socialization in the midst of a global pandemic. Immediately, or inevitably rather, we are in for a rude awakening. The failure of the spies was also a leadership success story. The spies failed because they lacked vision and foresight and a sense of personal and interpersonal responsibility, qualities essential for national self-determination. But God, Moses, Joshua, Caleb, they had these qualities. Acting as leaders, they recognized that the people simply aren't ready. They need to have specific experiences, to be sure, but mostly they need time. The details of those years are less important in some ways. Stuff happened. But the fact of those 40 years, 1 year, as Torah says, for each day, well, that's about savlanut. That's about patience, which in Hebrew is related to the word that means to bear, as in to bear a weight. Patience isn't easy, but it is necessary in order to allow time to move forward. Look around, folks. We are not ready. If you need proof, look at Florida. Look at Nevada, look at Georgia and Texas and Ohio. Look here in Maryland and Baltimore, where infection rates are beginning to rise again. Look at the whole of the United States in comparison to most of the world. 14 million confirmed cases, over 3.5 million of those right here in the US of A. Almost 600,000 global deaths, nearly 140,000 of those right here. We saw what happened when the Israelites defiantly marched toward the Promised Land, when they made the grave error of overestimating readiness. V'yakum v'yaktum, they were dealt a shattering blow. They disregarded the advice of the experts, the good leaders. Warnings went unheeded, and people died. Is there a silver lining to this story? Is there a happy ending? I think so. The Promised Land is still out there waiting for us to mature, to learn from our mistakes, to make wiser decisions, to merit the responsibility it demands. But it's going to take patience, and yes, it's going to take time. And it's going to take the willingness of more Americans to listen to those leaders who are giving good advice and ignore the disinformation, the sycophants, the demagogues, and other bad actors. As King Solomon learned when he commissioned a ring that would make him sad when he was happy and happy when he was sad, Gam ze ya'afor, this too shall pass. In the meantime, while we're waiting, there is still life to be lived, connections to be made, meaningful experiences to be had. In our Torah, we are moving into Devarim, anticipating the Promised Land. But right now, in this moment, in July of 2020, in Baltimore, Maryland, United States of America, welcome to the Midbar. May our wanderings lead us to a better, kinder, safer, and more fruitful existence. Shabbat Shalom.